"He's following me!" she cried. Mafia boss grabbed her waist and led her into the back of his car. The scent of stale coffee and grease clung to Cassandra Hart like a second skin. It was 2 a.m, and the neon sign of Lorenzo's Diner flickered with a dying buzz, casting an intermittent red glow onto the wet pavement of red pines. Cassie pushed the heavy glass door open with her shoulder, her hands stuffed deep into the pockets of her thin denim jacket. The wind cut right through the fabric, biting at her skin with the damp, unforgiving chill that settled over the city every November. She kept her head down. That was rule number 1 in Red Pines. Do not look at anyone. Do not stop. Just walk. Her tips for the night had been abysmal. She had counted them 3 times in the break room before clocking out. $42. It was barely enough to cover the electric bill that was already 2 weeks overdue, let alone the rent hike her landlord had taped to her door yesterday morning. Her fingers curled around the crumpled bills in her pocket, as if holding onto them tightly enough could make them multiply. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car hissing over the rain-slicked asphalt. The streetlights here were yellow and dim, leaving long stretches of shadow between the pools of light. Cassie walked briskly, her boots clicking rhythmically against the concrete. She knew the route by heart. 4 blocks down, turn left at the boarded-up pharmacy, then 2 more blocks to the crumbling brick building she called home. She was 2 blocks away from the diner when the feeling hit her. It was a prickle at the base of her neck, a primal instinct that predated logic. Someone was watching her. Cassie tightened her grip on her keys, threading the jagged metal stem of her house key between her knuckles. She did not turn around immediately. Instead, she listened. Over the distant hum of city traffic, she heard it, the heavy, deliberate scuff of boots hitting the pavement. They were not the erratic steps of a drunk stumbling home from the dive bars on 5th Street. They were steady, measured. She quickened her pace. Behind her, the footsteps sped up. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She risked a glance over her shoulder. About 50 feet back, a figure moved through the shadows. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled low, obscuring his face. His hands were buried in his pockets, and his posture was focused entirely on her. Cassie faced forward and walked faster, her breath hitching in her throat. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just walking the same way. She took the turn at the pharmacy sharply, almost jogging now. She waited, counting the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3. The man turned the corner. He was still there. He was still 50 feet behind her, matching her speed with terrifying ease. He was not just walking. He was hunting. Fear replaced the exhaustion in her bones. The alleyway that cut through the next block was a shortcut she usually avoided at night, but it would shave 3 minutes off her walk, and right now, 3 minutes felt like the difference between life and death. She made a split-second decision and bolted to her right, plunging into the narrow darkness between 2 towering brick warehouses. The alley was narrow, smelling of wet cardboard and rot. Cassie sprinted, her boots splashing through puddles that soaked her socks. She could hear the footsteps behind her break into a run. They were heavy, slapping hard against the wet ground. He was coming. He was going to catch her. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and blurring her vision. The end of the alley opened up onto the main avenue, where the streetlights were brighter. If she could just make it there, she could flag down a car or run into the 24-hour bodega. She burst out of the alleyway, gasping for air, and turned sharply to the left, and slammed directly into a wall of solid muscle. The impact knocked the breath out of her. She stumbled back, flailing, but strong hands caught her by the upper arms, steadying her with a grip that was firm and unyielding. Cassie looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man she had crashed into was tall, towering over her by nearly a foot. He wore a long, tailored wool coat that looked more expensive than everything she owned combined. His face was sharp angles and shadows, illuminated by the harsh white light of a street lamp. He had dark, intelligent eyes that looked down at her not with surprise, but with a calm, chilling stillness. "He is following me," she blurted out, the words tearing from her throat in a ragged gasp. She twisted in his grip, pointing back toward the dark mouth of the alley. "Please, there is a man. He's following me." The stranger did not look at the alley immediately. He looked at her. His gaze swept over her frantic face, her wide eyes, the way her chest heaved with panic. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he released her arms and swept her behind him. He did not speak. He simply turned his body, placing himself as a shield between her and the alleyway. A second later, the hooded figure skidded out of the darkness. The stalker stopped abruptly. He had clearly expected a terrified woman alone, easy prey to be cornered. Instead, he found himself facing a man who stood with the lethally relaxed posture of a predator who had no reason to fear anything. Dante Moretti stood perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He merely stared. His hands hung loosely by his sides, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a coiled readiness that radiated dangerous authority. The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the humid night air. The hooded man hesitated. He looked from Dante to Cassie, who was shrinking behind Dante's coat, clutching the fabric of his sleeve. The stalker seemed to weigh his options. Then, slowly, he took a step back, then another. The darkness of the alley seemed to swallow him whole as he turned and retreated, vanishing into the shadows from which he had come. Cassie let out a shuddering breath, her knees trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. Dante watched the alley for a long moment, ensuring the threat was gone. Then, he turned back to her. Up close, his eyes were the color of espresso, dark and impenetrable. He didn't offer a comforting smile. His expression remained guarded, almost clinical, as if he were assessing damage. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, a rich baritone that vibrated in the cold air. "No," Cassie whispered. She realized she was still gripping his expensive coat and snatched her hand back as if burned. "No, I am okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry I ran into you." "You were running for a reason," Dante said. He looked past her, toward the curb where a sleek, black sedan was idling. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like onyx. "You cannot walk home. Not tonight. I live just a few blocks away," Cassie stammered, though the thought of walking those blocks made her stomach churn with nausea. "I can run. I will be fast." "He will be waiting," Dante said simply. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Predators do not give up just because they are interrupted once. They circle back. He stepped toward the car, and the back door clicked open instantly, pushed from the inside by a driver she couldn't see. Dante held the door open and looked at her. It was a command disguised as an offer. "Get in." Cassie hesitated. Every instinct she had honed growing up in the foster system screamed at her not to get into a stranger's car. But then she looked back at the dark alley. She looked at the empty, desolate street. And she looked at the man standing before her. He was terrifying in a way she couldn't articulate, but he had stopped the monster in the alley. She stepped toward the car. Dante placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her in. His touch was brief, searingly warm through her thin jacket. He didn't shove her. He guided her with a strange, protective possessiveness that made her breath hitch again. She slid onto the leather seat. It was soft, smelling of rich mahogany and leather. It was warmer inside than out. Dante slid in beside her and pulled the door shut, sealing out the noise of the city. "Drive," Dante said to the front. The partition between the driver and the back seat was up. They were alone in the dim, ambient light of the back seat. The car moved forward smoothly, gliding over the potholes that usually rattled Cassie's teeth when she took the bus. Cassie sat with her hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead. She was shivering, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. Dante moved beside her. She flinched, but he was only reaching for a crystal decanter secured in a console to his right. He poured a small amount of amber liquid into a heavy glass tumbler and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. "It is whiskey. It will stop the shaking." Cassie took the glass with trembling fingers. "I do not drink. Make an exception," he advised calmly. She took a small sip. The liquid burned her throat, hot and fierce, but it settled the icy knot in her stomach. She coughed slightly, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. Amusement? Or maybe curiosity? "Who are you?" she asked, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. Dante settled back against the seat, crossing one leg over the other. His suit was impeccable, not a crease in sight despite the collision. "Someone who happened to be in the right place," he said smoothly. "That is not an answer," Cassie said. He turned his head to look at her fully. His gaze felt physical, like he was dissecting her, peeling back layers of secrets she didn't even know she had. "I am someone who makes problems disappear. Miss Cassie," she said automatically. Then she mentally kicked herself. She shouldn't be giving strangers her name. "Cassandra." "Cassandra," he repeated. The way he said her name, rolling the syllables slowly, made a shiver race down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Where are we going, Cassandra?" She gave him her address. It was humiliating to say the street name aloud in this car. It was the part of town where the streetlights were broken and the police rarely patrolled. But Dante didn't flinch or sneer. He simply pressed a button on the intercom and relayed the address to the driver. They drove in silence for several minutes. It wasn't an awkward silence, at least not for him. He seemed perfectly content to sit in the quiet, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. Cassie, however, felt like a wire pulled too tight. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You could have just stepped aside." "I do not like bullies," Dante said, his voice hardening slightly, "and I do not like men who hunt women in the dark." He looked at her again, his eyes dropping to her hands, which were red and chapped from the cold and the harsh dish soap at the diner. "Do you have anyone waiting for you at home? A boyfriend? A husband?" "No," Cassie said quickly. "Just me." Dante nodded once, as if filing that information away for later use. The car slowed as they turned onto her street. The reality of her life crashed back in. The peeling paint on the building, the overflowing dumpsters, the iron bars on the ground floor windows. The car stopped right in front of her building entrance. Dante did not get out, but he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small, matte black card with nothing on it but a series of 10 digits embossed in silver. No name, no company logo. He held it out to her. "Take this," he said. Cassie stared at the card. "What is it?" "A direct line," Dante said. "If you see him again, if you feel like someone is watching you, if you are scared, you call this number, day or night." "I cannot ask you to do that," Cassie said, shaking her head. "You are a stranger. You've done enough." Dante took her hand, ignoring her protest, and pressed the card into her palm. His fingers were rougher than she expected, calloused in a way that suggested he did not spend all his time signing papers behind a desk. He closed her fingers over the card. "Take it," he commanded softly. "Call if it happens again." Cassie looked into his eyes and found she couldn't argue. There was a force behind them, a gravity that pulled her in and made her want to obey. "Okay," she whispered. "Go," he said. "My driver will wait until you are inside the building." Cassie scrambled out of the car, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. She clutched the card in one hand and her keys in the other. She ran to the front door of her building, fumbling with the lock, conscious of the sleek black beast of a car idling at the curb behind her. She got the door open and slipped inside, locking it firmly behind her. She ran up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, her heart still racing. Once inside her small studio, she threw the deadbolt, then the chain, then wedged a chair under the doorknob, a habit she had developed years ago. She leaned against the door, sliding down until she hit the floor. The apartment was freezing. The radiator was broken again. She looked down at her hand. The black card was warm from her grip. Someone who makes problems disappear. She stood up and walked to the kitchen trash can. She hovered her hand over it. She should throw it away. Getting involved with men who drove cars like that and looked at people like they were targets. That was dangerous. She had spent her whole life running from dangerous men. She dropped the card into the trash, but as she walked away to the bathroom to wash the diner grease from her face, she found herself repeating the numbers in her head. 3, 1, 2, us, 5, 5, 5. She couldn't stop. The sequence burned itself into her memory instantly. That night, sleep came fitfully. Cassie tossed and turned on her lumpy mattress. The dream started the way it always did. Darkness, the smell of antiseptic and rusted metal. She was running, but her legs wouldn't move. There were voices, distorted and deep, arguing above her. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her side, like a brand being pressed into her flesh. She is the one. Mark her. Cassie woke up with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed, her body drenched in cold sweat. Her hand flew instinctively to her left side, just above her hip bone. She pulled up her oversized t-shirt. In the dim light of the street lamp filtering through her window, she could see the scar. It was pale and jagged, a strange, twisting shape that looked almost like a symbol, though she had never been able to decipher it. She had woken up with it 3 years ago in a hospital bed, with no memory of the week prior. She traced the raised skin with a trembling finger. The man in the hoodie. Had he known? Was he part of the darkness she couldn't remember? Across the city, in a penthouse that touched the clouds. Dante Moretti stood on his balcony. The city of Red Pines was spread out below him, a grid of lights and corruption. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, but he wasn't drinking. He was thinking about wide blue eyes and a woman who smelled like cheap coffee and fear. He turned back to the room. It was expansive, modern and cold. His lieutenant, Marco, was standing by the glass desk, typing on a tablet. "I have the name," Marco said, not looking up. "Cassandra Hart, 24 years old, works at Lorenzo's. No family, no records. She is a ghost, boss." Dante walked over to the desk and looked at the surveillance photo Marco had pulled up from the diner's security feed. It was grainy, but he could see her face. She looked tired. She was being followed, Dante said. By a professional? He moved like one of ours, or one of Vescari's. Vescari? Marco looked up, his brow furrowing. Why would the Vescari family be tailing a waitress? That is what I want to know, Dante said. He stared at the image of Cassie. There was something about her, a familiarity he couldn't place. It wasn't that he had met her before, but rather that she carried a weight he recognized, the weight of survival. "Run a deeper check," Dante ordered. "I want to know everything, where she was born, who her parents were, and why a hitman was 2 steps away from grabbing her tonight. And if the guy comes back?" Marco asked. Dante took a sip of his whiskey, the burn reminding him of the way she had looked at him in the car, terrified, yet trusting him despite herself. "If he comes back," Dante said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "we will be watching." Back in her apartment. Cassie stared at the ceiling. She couldn't go back to sleep. The fear was still thrumming in her veins. She got out of bed and walked back to the kitchen. She stared at the trash can. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was a mistake, but her hand moved on its own. She reached into the bin and pulled out the black card. She wiped a coffee stain off the corner and set it on her small, wobbly kitchen table. The silver numbers caught the moonlight. She didn't call. Not yet. But she didn't throw it away again either. The illusion of safety lasted exactly 48 hours. For 2 days. Cassandra Hart tried to convince herself that the encounter in the alley had been a fluke. She told herself that Red Pines was a city of millions and that bad things happened at random, like lightning strikes or lottery wins. She tried to bury the memory of the hooded figure under the monotonous rhythm of her life. Wake up, count the change in the jar, walk to work in the daylight, pour coffee, wipe tables, dodge the wandering hands of the regulars. Walk home before the sun went down completely. But the fear was a cold, heavy stone in her gut that refused to dissolve. It was Thursday night, and Lorenzo's diner was busier than usual. The air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and the murmur of tired conversations. Cassie moved through the chaos on autopilot, balancing 3 plates of meatloaf on her arm while her eyes darted instinctively toward the front window every time the door chimed. She was wiping down table 4, her back to the glass, when the fine hairs on her arms stood up. It was that same primal warning. the electric prickle of being hunted. Cassie froze, the rag in her hand hovering over a coffee stain. Slowly, terrified of what she would find, she lifted her head and looked toward the large plate glass window that faced the street. He was there. The man in the black hoodie stood on the other side of the glass, illuminated by the harsh neon glow of the diner's sign. He was not hiding in the shadows this time. He was standing right on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets, staring directly at her. The hood cast his face in darkness, but the angle of his head was unmistakable. He was watching her. He was waiting. A scream climbed up Cassie's throat, but she swallowed it down, choking on the taste of panic. He took a step toward the door. She dropped the rag. "Cassie, you okay?" One of the other waitresses, a kindly older woman named Bev, asked as she breezed past with a pot of coffee. Cassie did not answer. She backed away. Her eyes locked on the figure outside. He was reaching for the door handle. She turned and bolted. She pushed past the swinging doors of the kitchen, ignoring the shouts of the cook, and sprinted into the employee restroom at the back. She slammed the lock home, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The room was small, smelling of bleach and damp mop heads, but it was the only barrier she had. Her hands shook so violently she could barely unzip her apron pocket. She fumbled for the small, cheap cell phone she kept there. It slipped through her sweaty fingers and clattered onto the tile floor. Cassie dropped to her knees, snatching it up, praying the screen hadn't cracked. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. She had written the number down before throwing the card away, just in case. She dialed. Her fingers trembled over the keys. 3, 1, 2. The phone rang once, twice. "Speak." The voice on the other end was deep, calm, and instantly recognizable. It cut through the static of her panic like a blade. "It is him," Cassie whispered, her voice cracking. She was huddled on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. "He is here, at the diner. He is watching me through the window." There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy she could almost feel the drop in temperature. "Are you safe right now?" Dante Moretti asked. His tone had shifted. It was no longer casual. It was sharp, alert, and lethal. "I'm in the bathroom," she stammered. "I locked the door, but he was coming inside." "Stay there," Dante commanded. "Do not open the door for anyone but me. Do you understand? Anyone? Please," she breathed. "I am 2 minutes away," he said. "Hang up." The line went dead. Cassie stayed on the floor, clutching the phone to her chest. She stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. She could hear the muffled sounds of the diner outside, dishes clattering, the low hum of the jukebox. Every shadow under the door looked like a pair of boots. Every creak sounded like an intruder. Time stretched and warped. 2 minutes felt like 2 hours. Then, the atmosphere in the diner changed, even through the heavy door. Cassie heard it. The ambient noise dropped. The chatter stopped abruptly. It was the sound of a room reacting to a predator entering its midst. "Hey, you can't go back there," the cook shouted. "Move!" The single word was spoken quietly, but it carried enough force to rattle the walls. Heavy footsteps approached the bathroom door. Not the scuffling steps of the stalker, but the hard, decisive strike of expensive leather on tile. A knock. 3 sharp raps. "Cassandra!" Cassie scrambled to her feet. She unlocked the door and threw it open. Dante Moretti filled the door frame. He looked even larger and more imposing in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway than he had on the street. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than the entire building. His dark hair swept back, his face a mask of controlled fury. But when his eyes landed on her, the hardness fractured for a fraction of a second. He took in her pale face, her trembling hands, the way she was pressing herself against the sink for support. "Did he touch you?" Dante asked. He stepped into the small room, forcing her to look up at him. "No," she whispered. "I saw him and I ran." "Good," Dante said. "Come." He did not ask this time. He reached out and placed his hand firmly on her waist. His grip was possessive, his fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform just enough to ground her. It wasn't a gentle hold, it was an anchor. He guided her out of the restroom and into the kitchen. The cook and the dishwasher were pressed against the prep counters, eyes wide, staring at Dante with a mixture of awe and terror. Dante ignored them completely. He steered Cassie through the swinging doors and into the main dining area. The diner was silent. Every patron had stopped eating to watch the man who radiated power like heat from a furnace. Dante scanned the room. His eyes were cold, calculating, sweeping over every face in the booths. "Where is he?" "He was outside," Cassie said, keeping her head down, humiliated by the attention but too terrified to let go of Dante's side. "By the window." Dante looked at the window. Empty. "Let's go," he said. He didn't let go of her waist. He kept her tucked tight against his side, shielding her body with his own as they walked to the front door. When they stepped out into the cool night air, the black sedan was already waiting at the curb, the engine purring, the driver, a massive man with a scar running through his eyebrow, had the back door open before they even reached the curb. Dante guided her into the back seat and slid in after her. "Go," he ordered. As the car pulled away, merging seamlessly into the traffic, the adrenaline that had been holding Cassie upright suddenly evaporated. She slumped against the leather seat, a sob tearing from her throat. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "He knows where I work," she gasped, the reality crashing down on her. "He knows where I work. I can't go back. I can't go home." Dante watched her for a moment, his jaw tight. He reached for the decanter again, but this time he didn't pour a drink. He just gripped the glass, his knuckles white. "How many times?" he asked. His voice was low, simmering with an anger that filled the small space of the car. Cassie looked at him through her fingers. "What? How many times has he followed you since that night?" Dante demanded. He turned to face her, his dark eyes blazing. "Do not lie to me. Cassandra, I thought I saw him yesterday," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Down the street from my apartment, but I thought I was imagining it. I thought I was just being paranoid." "Paranoia keeps you alive," Dante snapped. "You should have called me yesterday." "I did not want to be a burden," Cassie cried, finding a spark of defiance in her fear. "I am a waitress. Dante, I do not have people like you on speed dial. I handle my own problems." "You are not handling this," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You are being hunted, and whoever this man is, he is escalating." He stood in the light. "He wanted you to see him. That means he is done playing with his food. He's ready to eat." Cassie fell silent, the brutal truth of his words silencing her arguments. She hugged her arms around herself, feeling small and exposed. Dante sighed, a harsh sound of frustration. He ran a hand through his hair, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, though no less commanding. "You are not going back to that apartment? I have nowhere else to go," Cassie said softly. "You are coming with me," Dante stated. "I have a guest suite. The building is a fortress. Private security on every floor, cameras covering every inch of the perimeter. You will stay there until I find this man and put him in the ground." "I can't," Cassie protested weakly. "I barely know you." Dante leaned in close, invading her personal space until all she could smell was sandalwood and expensive whiskey. "You know I am the only thing standing between you and the man in the hoodie. That is enough." Cassie looked at him. He was right. She had no money, no family, and no weapons. She was a rabbit trying to outrun a wolf, and Dante was the only one offering her a den. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The drive took 20 minutes. They moved from the crumbling streets of Red Pines to the glittering skyline of the financial district. The car turned into the underground garage of a glass and steel spire that pierced the clouds. They took a private elevator up. Cassie watched the numbers climb, 10, 20, 30, 40. Her ears popped. When the doors slid open, Cassie stepped out and stopped dead. The penthouse was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was vast, an expanse of white marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. The furniture was modern, sleek, and dark. It was beautiful, but it was cold. It looked like a museum, not a home. "Marco," Dante said to the empty air. A man appeared from a hallway on the left. He was younger than Dante, with sharp features and a tablet in his hand. "Boss," Marco said, nodding. He glanced at Cassie with a flicker of surprise, but masked it quickly. "Miss Hart will be staying with us," Dante said. "Set up the guest suite in the East Wing, and put a detail on the lobby. No one comes up without my personal authorization, not even God." "Understood," Marco said. He tapped something into his tablet. "I pulled the footage from the diner's security cameras. We have a face." Dante's eyes darkened. "Good. Run it through every database we have. Facial recognition, police records, the other families. Find him." Marco nodded and disappeared back down the hall. Dante turned to Cassie. She was standing awkwardly in the center of the room, still clutching her purse, looking entirely out of place in her grease-stained diner uniform against the pristine marble. "Come," he said, his voice softer now. "I will show you your room." He led her down a long corridor lined with abstract art. He stopped at a heavy oak door and pushed it open. The room was larger than her entire apartment. It had a king-sized bed with white linens, a private balcony, and an ensuite bathroom that looked like a spa. "It is too much," Cassie murmured, stepping inside. "It is safe," Dante corrected. He stepped in after her to show her the controls for the lights and the blinds. The room was narrow near the entrance, and as he moved past her, the space felt suddenly charged. He was close, too close. Cassie looked up, and Dante looked down. The air between them seemed to thicken, humming with a sudden, undeniable tension. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before settling on the small of her back again. The heat of his palm burned through her uniform. "You are safe here, Cassandra," he said quietly. "Sleep. We will talk in the morning." He pulled his hand away slowly, letting his fingertips graze her spine, and then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Cassie showered, scrubbing her skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the feeling of the stalker's eyes. She didn't have any clothes with her, so she found a clean, white button-down shirt hanging in the closet that clearly belonged to Dante. It was huge on her, hitting her mid-thigh. The sleeves swallowing her hands, she rolled them up and buttoned it to the neck. She tried to sleep, but the silence of the penthouse was deafening. After an hour of staring at the ceiling, she gave up. She wandered out of the room, her bare feet silent on the marble. The penthouse was dark, lit only by the glow of the city outside. She found Dante in the kitchen, or rather, on the balcony attached to the kitchen. The glass door was open, letting in the cold night wind. He was leaning against the railing, looking out over the city, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He had taken off his jacket and tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. Cassie hesitated, but he spoke without turning around. "You should be asleep." She stepped onto the balcony, hugging her arms against the chill. The wind whipped her hair across her face. "I couldn't—" "It is too quiet." Dante turned. His eyes swept over her, taking in the sight of her in his shirt. His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze lingering on her bare legs before snapping back to her face. "The quiet takes some getting used to," he admitted. He took a drag of the cigarette, the embers glowing bright orange. "In my world, quiet usually means you are about to be attacked, but up here, it is just distance." Cassie moved to stand beside him, looking down at the grid of streetlights far below. "Do you think you will find him?" "I will find him," Dante said. It was a promise, absolute and ironclad. "Why?" Cassie asked, turning to look at his profile. "Why go to all this trouble for me? I am nobody. Dante, I am just a girl who serves coffee." Dante crushed the cigarette out in a crystal ashtray on the railing. He turned his body fully toward her. "You are not nobody." "I feel like prey," Cassie whispered, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "My whole life, I have felt like something small that big things want to eat, in foster homes, on the streets. I always feel like I'm running, and I don't even know what I am running from." The vulnerability in her voice cracked the last of Dante's reserve. He stepped closer, boxing her in against the railing. Though he didn't touch her, his body shielded her from the wind. "You are not prey," he said intensely. "Not anymore." He reached out. His hand was large, warm, and dangerous. He brushed a strand of dark hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jawline, the rough skin of his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. Cassie's breath hitched. She looked up at him, her lips parting slightly. Her heart was hammering, but not from fear, not this time. Dante stared at her mouth. The hunger in his eyes was raw, a stark contrast to his usual composure. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Cassie could feel the heat radiating off him. She wanted him to close the gap. She leaned forward instinctively, her hands clutching the railing behind her. But Dante stopped. He closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling sharply, and then pulled back. He dropped his hand from her face. "Go to bed, Cassandra," he rasped, his voice rougher than before. "Before I forget that I am trying to protect you." The moment hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Cassie nodded, unable to speak, and retreated back into the safety of the glass house. Dante stayed on the balcony, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. He watched her go, fighting every instinct he had to follow her, inside the penthouse, in the makeshift command center Marco had set up in the study. A computer screen beeped. Marco sat up, rubbing his tired eyes. The facial recognition software had finally spit out a match. 2 photos appeared on the screen side by side. One was the grainy shot from the diner window. The other was a mugshot from 3 years ago. Marco swore softly. He picked up his phone and dialed Dante's personal line, even though his boss was only 20 feet away on the balcony. "Boss," Marco said when Dante answered. "We got him." "Who is he?" Dante asked. "His name is Mason Vane," Marco said grimly. "He's a freelancer, but look at his known associates." Dante walked into the study, the phone still to his ear. He looked at the screen Marco was pointing at. There, listed under known affiliations, was a name that made Dante's blood run cold. The Viscari family. "He's not just a stalker," Dante said, his voice deadly quiet. "He is a soldier, and he is not watching her for fun." "No," Marco agreed. "He's watching her for Adrian Viscari." Dante looked toward the hallway where Cassie was sleeping. The pieces were starting to click together, forming a picture that was far more dangerous than a simple obsession. "Secure the floor," Dante ordered. "Double the guard. If Viscari is involved, this is not just stalking. It is an operation." He stared at the door to the east wing. "And she is the target." The sun had not yet risen over the city of red pines, but the world inside the penthouse was already awake and moving with the silent, deadly precision of a clock mechanism. In the glass-walled study that overlooked the gray dawn, Dante Moretti stood with his back to the room, watching the fog roll off the river. He wore a fresh white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the intricate ink of tattoos that usually remained hidden beneath his tailored suits. On the desk behind him, a man, not the stalker, but a low-level runner Marco had snatched from a street corner 2 hours ago, sat bound to a chair, sweating through his cheap jacket. Marco stood over the man, wiping his knuckles with a handkerchief. "He talks," Marco said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The man in the hoodie is confirmed. His name is Mason Vane. He's a freelancer, but his leash is held by one hand only." Dante turned slowly. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in the runner's veins. "Viscari. Adrian Viscari," Marco confirmed. "This rat says Viscari has been moving assets into the city for months, quietly, buying up old warehouses, paying off the Port Authority. And he hired Mason specifically for the girl." Dante walked to the desk. He did not shout. He did not strike the bound man. He simply leaned down, placing both hands on the mahogany surface, and stared. "Why?" The runner swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Dante and Marco. "I don't know why. Mr. Moretti, I swear, I just know the order. Viscari said she is the loose end. He said she is the key to breaking you." Dante straightened up. "Get him out of here," he said to Marco. "Drop him at the precinct with a pound of heroin in his pocket. Let the cops handle the trash." As Marco dragged the protesting man out, Dante turned back to the window. The name Vascari tasted like ash in his mouth. Adrian Vascari had once been an ally, a man Dante had broken bread with. Now, he has a disease spreading through the city. And somehow, Cassandra Hart, a waitress with sad eyes and holes in her boots, was at the center of Vascari's war against him. Cassie woke to silence. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The sheets beneath her were too soft, the air too cool and clean. Then the memory of the night before crashed over her. The diner, the stalker, the car, the way Dante's hand had felt on the small of her back. She sat up, clutching the duvet to her chest. The guest room was flooded with pale morning light. It was beautiful, but the silence felt heavy. It was the silence of a vault. She was safe here, yes, but she was also contained. She slid out of bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. She was still wearing Dante's oversized shirt, which smelled faintly of sandalwood and tobacco. She opened the door and peered into the hallway. Empty. She began to walk, her fingers trailing along the smooth plaster of the walls. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern design, all sharp angles and monochrome colors, but it felt devoid of life. It was a fortress built for a man who expected to be attacked, not a home for a man who wanted to live. She wandered into what looked like a library or a private lounge. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened. On a side table, tucked behind a bottle of aged scotch, was a small, silver-framed photograph. Cassie picked it up. It was an old photo, the colors slightly faded. It showed two young men standing on a dock, the ocean stretching out behind them. One was clearly Dante, though he looked younger, his face less hardened by the brutal realities of his trade. He was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face. His arm was draped around the shoulders of another boy, who looked enough like him to be a brother, but with softer eyes and a mischievous grin. "That is Luca." Cassie gasped and spun around, nearly dropping the frame. Dante was standing in the doorway. He held 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising from them in curling ribbons. He wasn't looking at her with anger, but his eyes were fixed on the photo in her hands. "Your brother?" Cassie asked softly, placing the frame back on the table with care. "My younger brother," Dante corrected. He walked into the room and extended one of the mugs to her. "Drink. You take it with milk and 2 sugars. Correct?" Cassie blinked, surprised he remembered from the brief moments at the diner. "Yes, thank you." She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. "He looks happy. In the photo?" "He was," Dante said. He walked past her to the window, staring out at the skyline. "He was the best of us. He didn't have the stomach for the business, but he had the heart for the family. He is away right now." The vagueness of his answer hung in the air. Cassie sensed a wall going up, a barrier she wasn't supposed to cross. "You miss him." "I miss the way things were," Dante said, sidestepping the emotion. "Come, breakfast is ready." They ate in the kitchen at the Granite Island. A chef had apparently come and gone, leaving behind plates of eggs, fruit, and pastries. But Dante showed no interest in the food. He drank his black coffee and watched her eat with an intensity that made it hard for Cassie to swallow. "Why does Vascari want me?" Cassie asked, breaking the silence. She set her fork down. "I have been thinking about it all morning. I have nothing. I own nothing. Why me?" Dante set his mug down. "It is not about what you own, Cassandra. In my world, people are rarely targets for their money. They are targets for what they know, who they love, or what they represent." "Your world," Cassie repeated. "You keep saying that. What is your world, Dante? You say you make problems disappear. You have drivers, security guards, penthouses. You are not just a businessman." Dante leaned forward, his elbows resting on the granite. "No, I am not. I run this city's underworld, Cassandra. The unions, the ports, the gambling. I keep the order. When men like Vascari try to bring chaos and drugs into my streets, I stop them. It is a violent life, but it has rules. and rule number 1 is that we do not touch civilians." Cassie felt a chill run through her. She had suspected it, of course. The car, the attitude, the fear in the eyes of the cook at the diner. But hearing him say it, calmly, without apology, made it real. She was sitting across from a monster, a handsome, protective monster, but a monster nonetheless. "And you think I'm just a civilian?" she asked. "Are you?" Dante countered. "You have a scar on your side. You have nightmares. You have a history you cannot remember. That does not sound like a civilian life to me." Cassie looked down at her plate. The shame of her past always made her feel small, but under Dante's gaze, she felt a strange urge to be honest, to let him see the cracks. "I was in the system until I was 18, she said quietly. "Foster homes. Some were okay, most were not. I learned to be invisible. When I aged out, I met a guy, Mason." Dante's eyes narrowed imperceptibly at the name, but he didn't interrupt. "He was charming at first," Cassie continued, her voice tight. "But then he got possessive, controlling. He told me I was nothing without him. 3 years ago, I tried to leave him. We had a fight. I remember running out the door, and then nothing." "Nothing?" Dante asked softly. "I woke up a week later in a hospital in another city," Cassie said, unconsciously touching her side. "The doctor said I had been found wandering the highway. I had a concussion, bruises, and the scar. It was fresh. It looked like a brand, but I couldn't remember how I got it. I still can't. The week is just a black hole." Dante remained silent for a long time. He was looking at her, but his mind was clearly working through the new information, fitting pieces of a puzzle together. The anger she had seen in him earlier returned, but it wasn't directed at her. It was a protective fury, burning low and hot. "You are not invisible," Dante said finally. His voice was rough. "Not to me." The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something magnetic. "We should eat," Cassie said breathlessly, needing to break the moment before it consumed her. Later that afternoon, the heavy atmosphere of the penthouse became suffocating. To distract herself, Cassie went to the kitchen. She needed to do something with her hands. She found a bag of flour and some eggs and decided to make pasta from scratch, something her one good foster mother had taught her. She was covered in a fine dusting of white flour when Dante walked in. He had been on calls all day, his tie loosened, his face weary. He stopped in the doorway, blinking at the sight of his pristine, industrial kitchen now looking like a bakery had exploded in it. "I was bored," Cassie said defensively, wiping a flour-streaked hand across her forehead, likely leaving more white smudges behind. "I thought I would make dinner." Dante looked at the mess, and then at her. A corner of his mouth twitched. Then, the impossible happened. He laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a rich, deep sound that rumbled in his chest and made his eyes crinkle at the corners. It transformed him from the terrifying mafia don into a man who was simply amused by the chaos in his home. "You have flour on your nose," he said, walking toward her. "I do not," Cassie protested, trying to wipe it off but missing. "Here." Dante reached out. He didn't use a towel. He used his thumb, gently brushing the white powder from the tip of her nose. His touch lingering sent a jolt of electricity straight to Cassie's core. The laughter died in her throat. The kitchen went silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Dante didn't pull his hand away. He let it slide down to cup her jaw, his palm rough and warm against her skin. He stepped closer, crowding her space until her back bumped against the edge of the marble counter. "Cassandra," he murmured. His eyes dropped to her lips, dark with intent. Cassie's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt trapped, but she didn't want to escape. She wanted him to close the distance. She wanted to know if the fire she sensed in him would burn her or save her. Dante moved with deliberate slowness. He placed his other hand on the counter on the other side of her waist, boxing her in. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the coffee and mint on his breath. "Do you trust me?" he asked. The question was heavy, loaded with implications that went far beyond safety. Cassie looked into his eyes eyes that had seen violence and death, but were currently looking at her as if she were the only precious thing in the world. "Yes," she whispered. Dante didn't hesitate. He closed the gap, capturing her lips with his. It wasn't a gentle, tentative first kiss. It was a claim. It was hungry and possessive, filled with the pent-up tension of the last 3 days. Cassie gasped, her hands flying up to grip the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Dante groaned low in his throat. He effortlessly lifted her, sitting her onto the edge of the counter so they were eye level. His hands moved to her waist, gripping her tightly, pulling her body flush against his. The kiss deepened, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting her, devouring her. Cassie's fingers tangled in his hair, her body arching into him. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel weak. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt powerful. She felt desired. The heat between them was a physical weight, heavy and intoxicating. Dante's hand slid up her back, pressing her closer. But then, just as the moment threatened to spiral out of control, he froze. He tore his mouth away from hers, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were shaking slightly where they gripped her waist. "Dante?" she whispered, her lips swollen and red. "No," he rasped, forcing himself to step back. He didn't let go of her completely, but he put a distinct distance between their bodies. "Not like this. Not while you are scared and running. I will not be another man who takes something from you just because you are vulnerable." "I wanted you to," Cassie said, her voice trembling with the rejection. "I know," Dante said, his eyes burning with intensity. "And I want you. More than I have wanted anything in a decade. But I want you when you are safe. When you are sure. Not until you are sure." He smoothed her hair back one last time, his touch tender, before turning and walking out of the kitchen, leaving Cassie sitting on the counter, breathless and aching, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dante walked straight to the study, his blood still boiling, his body tight with the effort it had taken to walk away from her. Marco was waiting for him. The lieutenant's face was grim. "We got the full report on the scar," Marco said without preamble. Dante walked to the wet bar and poured himself a drink, his hands finally steadying. "Tell me." "It is a Vascari signature," Marco said, "but it is old school. They used to do it to women who were leveraged, wives, daughters, girlfriends of men they needed to control. It is a brand of ownership. It means, this belongs to the family." Dante slammed the glass down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She said she had an ex, Mason?" "That tracks," Marco said, pulling up a file on the tablet. "Mason Vane. He wasn't just her boyfriend, Dante. He was her handler. Vascari assigned him to her 3 years ago. They were grooming her, using her as a sleeper agent or a pawn for something big, but she ran. That week she can't remember? That was probably them trying to reprogram her or punish her. She escaped, but they marked her so they could find her again." Dante felt a cold rage settle in his chest. It was worse than he expected. It wasn't just a random obsession. Cassie had been a pawn in Vascari's game for years, and she didn't even know it. The man she had loved, the man she had run from. He was the monster hunting her now. "Does she know?" Dante asked. "About Mason being the hitman?" "No," Marco said. "And she doesn't know that her boyfriend was on Vascari's payroll the whole time. Do not tell her," Dante ordered. "Not tonight. She has had enough. We tell her when we have Mason in a hole in the ground." Marco nodded and left the room. Dante sank onto the leather couch in the study. He was exhausted. The weight of the war with Vascari, the safety of his brother Luca, and now the terrifying vulnerability of the woman in the next room pressed down on him. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Hours later, the door creaked open. Cassie stood there, wrapped in a silk robe she had found in the guest room. She had come to find him, unable to sleep after the electricity in the kitchen. She found him asleep on the leather sofa, one arm thrown over his eyes, his breathing deep and even. He looked younger when he slept, the lines of stress smoothed away from his forehead. Cassie walked quietly into the room. She picked up a cashmere throw blanket from the armrest and gently draped it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. She stood over him for a long moment, watching him. He was a dangerous man. He had admitted it. But he was also the man who had stopped a predator in an alley. The man who had laughed at her flower-covered nose. The man who had stopped kissing her because he respected her too much to take advantage of her fear. She leaned down, her hair brushing his cheek, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his temple. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. "I do trust you now," she whispered into the darkness. She turned and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, unaware that in the shadows of the city below, the man named Mason was sharpening his knife, waiting for the moment the beast left his tower. Time in the penthouse moved differently than it did on the streets below. In Red Pines, time was measured in shifts worked, bills paid, and the distance between paychecks. But in Dante Moretti's fortress of glass and steel, time was a fluid, suspended thing, measured only by the changing light against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the growing, magnetic pull between two people who were trying desperately not to fall. Over the next week, a routine formed, fragile and domestic. Mornings were quiet. Cassie would wake to the smell of espresso, finding Dante already at the kitchen island, reading reports on a tablet. He would never smile outright, but his eyes would soften the moment she walked in, tracking her movement across the room with a focused intensity that made her skin prickle. They ate dinner together every night, sometimes takeout from the finest restaurants in the city, sometimes simple meals Cassie insisted on cooking to prove she wasn't a guest, but a participant in this strange cohabitation. They talked, tentatively at first, then with more ease. Dante told her about the architecture of the city, pointing out buildings he owned and the ones he intended to buy. He spoke of art and history, revealing a mind that was as cultivated as it was dangerous. Cassie spoke of the books she read during slow shifts at the diner, of her childhood dream of seeing the ocean, of the small, gritty victories of surviving alone. But beneath the surface of these quiet moments, the danger was always there, humming like a high-tension wire. Marco came and went, his face always grim, whispering updates to Dante that made the muscles in Dante's jaw tighten. Cassie saw the gun Dante kept in the drawer by the front door. She saw the way he checked the security feeds before he let her stand near a window. They were in the eye of the hurricane, and the wall of the storm was closing in. It broke on a Tuesday evening. A violent storm swept in from the coast, battering the city with torrential rain and gale-force winds. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thunder rattled the heavy panes of glass in the living room. Dante was in his study, on a conference call that sounded like an argument. Cassie, feeling restless and caged, wandered into the living room. The power of the storm called to something wild inside her. She unlocked the heavy sliding glass door to the main terrace and stepped out. The wind hit her instantly, whipping her hair across her face. The rain was cold and driving, soaking her thin blouse within seconds. She didn't care. She walked to the railing, gripping the cold metal, and looked out at the city, which was now just a blur of gray and rain-slicked lights. The noise was deafening. The howl of the wind, the crash of thunder, and for the first time in days, she felt truly awake. She wasn't the fragile girl hiding in a tower. She was part of the storm. She didn't hear the door slide open behind her. She didn't know he was there until she felt the heavy warmth of wool descend over her shoulders. Dante wrapped his long black coat around her, pulling the lapels tight to shield her from the deluge. He didn't pull her back inside immediately. Instead, he stood behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his chin resting near her ear. "You will catch your death," he murmured, his voice low enough to rumble through her chest, audible even over the wind. "I like it," Cassie shouted back, not turning around. She leaned back into him, trusting his strength to hold her up against the gale. "It feels real. Everything else feels like a dream." Dante's arms came around her waist, locking her against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of rain and skin. "And I?" he asked. "Am I dreaming?" Cassie turned in his arms. The coat was huge on her, engulfing her frame, but it smelled like him. Smoke, cedar, and rain. She looked up at him. His hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his eyelashes. He looked stripped of his usual armor, raw and hungry. "No," she whispered, reaching up to touch his wet face. "You are the most real thing I have ever known." Lightning flashed, illuminating the sharp angles of his face, and the restraint Dante had been exercising for days finally snapped. He didn't ask permission this time. The question had been asked and answered in the silence of the last week. He swept her up into his arms, lifting her effortlessly as the rain soaked them both. Cassie wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in his neck as he carried her back inside, kicking the sliding door shut behind them and sealing out the roar of the wind. The silence of the penthouse returned, but it was heavy now, charged with a terrifying heat. Dante didn't put her down. He carried her through the living room, down the hall, and into his bedroom, a room she had never entered. It was dark, masculine, and smelled of him. He set her down on the edge of the massive bed. The only light came from the city glow filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Dante stood between her knees, breathing hard. He reached out and slowly, with trembling fingers, began to unbutton the sodden shirt she was wearing. His eyes never left hers. There was a reverence in his touch that made Cassie's throat tight. He wasn't stripping her. He was unveiling her. "You are shaking," he whispered, brushing his knuckles against her collarbone. "Not from the cold," she admitted. He peeled the wet fabric from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. Then he shed his own jacket and shirt, revealing the hard plains of his chest, the scars of old battles, and the dark ink that swirled across his skin. When they finally lay back against the cool sheets, skin against skin, the sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't just friction. It was a collision of two lonely souls finding an anchor. Dante moved over her, bracing his weight on his forearms, framing her face with his hands. He kissed her, not with the aggressive hunger of the kitchen, but with a slow, devastating tenderness that unmade her completely. "Cassandra," he whispered against her lips, as if the name were a prayer. "I will not hurt you. I will never hurt you. I know," she breathed, arching into his touch. "I am yours. Dante, I am yours." The act was a revelation. For Cassie, who had only known taking, Dante gave. He worshipped her body with a focus that bordered on obsession, learning the map of her scars and her size. When he finally entered her, he watched her face, waiting for her to adjust, to accept him. And when she did, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him deeper, the connection burned away the last of the fear. There was no mafia boss, no waitress, no war outside. There was only the rhythm of their breath, the heat of their bodies, and the desperate, silent promise that they belonged to each other. They fell asleep tangled together, the storm outside reduced to a distant lullaby. Morning arrived with a cruel brilliance. The sun cut through the clouds, flooding the room with a light that felt too sharp, too exposing. Cassie woke up alone. She reached out across the sheets, finding the other side of the bed cold. Panic flared for a second, an old reflex, until she heard voices drifting from the hallway. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her, a smile touching her lips as she remembered the night before. She felt different, changed, stronger. She found a silk robe on the chair, Dante's, and wrapped it around herself. She walked barefoot toward the study, intending to surprise him, to see if the tenderness of the night had survived the sunrise. The door to the study was ajar. Dante's voice floated out, hard and brittle as ice. "Alive. You're certain?" "100%, Marco's voice replied. The fingerprint analysis from the warehouse came back. It matches the prints found in the apartment 3 years ago. Mason Vane didn't just disappear. Dante, he went underground. Vescari recruited him right after the girl ran. Cassie froze in the hallway, her hand hovering over the doorframe. The blood drained from her face. "Mason. He's been working for Vescari this whole time?" Dante asked, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. "And Cassie? Does Vescari know who she is to him?" Vescari knows everything, Marco said. That is why he sent Mason. It is psychological warfare. He's using her trauma to get to you, just like he used Luca. Cassie's breath hitched. She stepped into the doorway, the silk robe rustling. Both men spun around. Dante's face went pale when he saw her. He looked as if he had been caught holding a smoking gun. Cassandra. He's alive? Cassie asked, her voice trembling. She looked from Dante to Marco. Mason is alive? Dante signaled Marco to leave with a sharp jerk of his head. Marco hesitated, then brushed past Cassie, closing the door behind him. Cassandra, listen to me, Dante began, stepping toward her. Do not lie to me, she snapped, backing away. I heard you. Mason is alive. He's working for this Vescari man, and you knew. I suspected, Dante corrected, stopping his approach. I only got the confirmation 5 minutes ago. And the rest? Cassie demanded, her hands clutching the robe tight. You said Vescari used your brother. You said he is using me like he used Luca. What does that mean, Dante? Dante ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. He walked to the window, unable to look at the betrayal in her eyes. 3 years ago, Adrian Vescari and I were fighting for territory. I was winning. Vescari couldn't get to me, so he went after Luca. Luca was innocent. He was a university student. Vescari planted evidence, DNA, a weapon, connecting Luca to the murder of a federal judge. It was a frame job, perfect and unbreakable. He turned back to her. Luca is serving 25 years in a maximum security prison because I couldn't protect him. And now, Vescari is doing it again. He found you, a woman with a mysterious past and a connection to his new hitman, and he is using you to draw me out, to make me reckless. Cassie stared at him, her heart hammering. The horror of it washed over her. She wasn't just a victim of a stalker. She was a pawn in a war between crime lords. Her pain, her fear, her scarred history, it was all just leverage to them. And that is why you brought me here, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Not because you cared, but because you didn't want to lose another piece on the board. No, Dante said fiercely, crossing the room in 2 strides to grab her shoulders. No, I brought you here because I saw you. Because from the moment you crashed into me, I couldn't look away. Last night was real. Cassandra, do not insult me by saying it wasn't. Then why didn't you tell me, she cried, pulling away from him. Why did you let me sleep in your bed, thinking I was finally safe, while you knew the monster from my nightmares was out there on your payroll's radar? Because I wanted you to have one night, Dante said, his voice cracking. One night where you weren't looking over your shoulder. That wasn't your choice to make, Cassie shouted. My whole life, men have made choices for me. Mason told me what to wear, what to say. You tell me where to sleep, what to know. I am done. I am done being managed. Cassandra, you cannot leave, Dante said, panic edging into his voice. It is not safe. It is not safe anywhere, she retorted. But at least in my apartment, the only lies are the ones I tell myself. She turned and ran back to the bedroom. She dressed in record time, pulling on her old jeans and the boots that were still damp from the rain. When she came out, Dante was standing in the living room. He looked like he had been carved from stone, but his eyes were pleading. I can have guards outside your building, he said quietly. Invisible. You won't know they are there. I don't want your guards. Dante, Cassie said, her hand on the door handle. I want the truth. And until you can give me that without me having to overhear it through a door, I can't be here. She opened the door. Cassie, he said. She stopped, but didn't turn. I will come for you, he said. When it is safe, I will come. Goodbye, Dante, she whispered, and walked out. The return to her apartment felt like stepping back into a grave. The air in her unit was stale and cold. The radiator clanked uselessly in the corner. Cassie sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, staring at the cracks in the plaster. The silence here wasn't heavy like the penthouse. It was hollow. She had been home for 4 hours. She had scrubbed the floor. She had reorganized her meager pantry. She was trying to reclaim her space, to convince herself that she was better off here, free and independent, but her skin still burned with the memory of Dante's touch. Her heart ached with a physical hollowness. She missed him. God help her. She missed him already. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across her floor. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Cassie jumped. She picked it up. Unknown caller. She hesitated. It could be Dante. He had said he would call. She pressed the answer. Hello? Hello, Cassie. The voice was digital, distorted, metallic, and grating. It wasn't Dante. Cassie stood up, her blood running cold. Who is this? You have been very hard to find, the voice rasped. We lost you for a few days, high up in the tower, but gravity always wins, doesn't it? You always have to come down. Leave me alone, Cassie whispered, backing toward the door. Open the door, Cassie, the voice said. No. Open the door, or I burn the building down with everyone inside. Cassie froze. She looked at the door. The wood was thin, the lock was cheap. Suddenly, the wood splintered inward with a deafening crash. Cassie screamed and scrambled back, grabbing a lamp from the table to use as a weapon. A figure stepped through the ruined doorway. He wasn't wearing a hood this time. He was tall, lean, with a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, a face she had loved once, a face that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. Mason Vane smiled. Hi, babe, he said softly. Miss me? Get away from me! Cassie swung the lamp, but Mason caught her wrist with terrifying speed. He twisted her arm, forcing her to drop the lamp, and slammed her back against the wall. You have been a bad girl, Mason whispered, leaning in close. Sleeping with the enemy. Adrian isn't happy, but don't worry. We're going to fix you. He pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket. Cassie struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was too strong. He jammed the needle into her neck. The world tilted. The edges of her vision went gray. Her legs gave out. That's it, Mason cooed, catching her as she fell. Time to go. He scooped her up in his arms and walked out of the apartment. Stepping over the broken door, Dante Moretti was pacing the length of his living room, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He had given her 6 hours. 6 hours to cool off. 6 hours to remember that she wasn't safe. He couldn't wait any longer. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the private security detail he had stationed, against her wishes, down the street from her building. Report, Dante barked. Sir, we have a situation, the guard stammered. We just found the team at the back entrance. They are unconscious. Someone got the drop on them. Dante's heart stopped. The girl. Check the girl. We are heading up now. Dante didn't wait. Marco! He roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. Marco ran in from the study. Get the car, Dante commanded, grabbing his shoulder holster and shrugging it over his shirt. She is gone. Check the localized feeds, Marco shouted, grabbing his tablet as they ran for the elevator. I hacked the bodega camera across the street from her place. They were in the elevator, descending at sickening speed, when Marco's tablet pinged. I have it, Marco said, his voice grim. Dante ripped the tablet from his hands. The footage was black and white, grainy, but clear enough. It showed the entrance to Cassie's building. A black van was idling at the curb. The front door of the building opened. A man walked out, carrying a limp woman in his arms. Her head lolled back, her dark hair sweeping the pavement. The man looked up. Directly at the camera, Mason Vane winked. Then he threw Cassie into the back of the van, slammed the doors, and drove away. Dante stared at the screen. The image of Cassie, unconscious, helpless, in the hands of the man who had scarred her, burned into his retinas. A sound tore from his throat, a guttural roar of pure, animalistic rage that made Marco flinch. Dante smashed the tablet against the elevator wall, shattering the screen into 1,000 spiderweb fractures. Vescari, Dante snarled, his voice vibrating with the promise of violence. The elevator doors opened into the garage. Dante strode toward his car, moving with the terrifying purpose of a man who had nothing left to lose. Call everyone, Dante ordered, sliding into the driver's seat. Call the capos. Call the street crews. Call the corrupt cops. I don't care if we have to burn this city to the ground. I want every road blocked. I want every warehouse searched. He started the engine. The car roaring to life like a beast waking up. We are going to war. The smell of rust and stagnant water was the first thing to drag Cassie back to consciousness. It was a thick, metallic scent that coated the back of her throat, choking her before she even opened her eyes. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, keeping time with the frantic beating of her heart. She tried to move her hands, but they were bound tight behind her back, the rough hemp of the rope biting into her wrists. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was seated in a metal chair in the center of a cavernous, dim space. It looked like an abandoned shipyard warehouse. High above, moonlight filtered through shattered skylights, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. The floor was stained concrete, littered with old chains and rotting pallets. "Welcome back." "Sleeping Beauty." The voice came from the shadows to her left. It was smooth, mocking, and terrifyingly familiar. Cassie turned her head, fighting the wave of dizziness. Mason Vane stepped into the pool of pale light. He looked exactly as he had in the hallway of her apartment building, handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He wore a dark leather jacket and held a silver lighter in his hand, flipping the lid open and closed with a rhythmic clink, clink, clink. "Mason," Cassie rasped. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "You look good, Cassie," he said, circling her chair like a shark. "A little pale, but the fear suits you. It always did. Why are you doing this?" she asked, tugging uselessly at her bonds. You said you loved me." Mason stopped in front of her and laughed. It was a cold, empty sound. "Love? Cassie, look at where you are. Look at who I am. Do you really think men like me fall in love? That was the job." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the peppermint of his gum, masking the scent of tobacco. 3 years ago, Adrian Vascari needed an interview with the Moretti family, Mason explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But Dante Moretti doesn't have weaknesses. He doesn't gamble, he doesn't use, and he doesn't let people close, except for one thing. He has a savior complex. He likes broken things. He likes to fix them." Cassie froze. The air in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. "So we made you broken," Mason said with a cruel smile. "We picked a girl from the system. No family, no one misses her. I became the boyfriend from hell. We scripted the trauma, Cassie, the controlling behavior, the fear, and then, when you tried to run, we gave you the scar." He reached out and poked her side, right where the jagged mark lay beneath her shirt. Cassie flinched violently. "We marked you," Mason continued, straightening up, "and then we waited. We knew eventually you would run into him, or we would make sure you did. We just needed Dante to see a damsel in distress, and once he let you in, once he let his guard down to play hero, Vascari would have the leverage he needed." "I was just bait," Cassie whispered, the realization shattering her. All her pain, her years of looking over her shoulder, it had all been engineered, a play written by cruel men to trap another man. "You were the perfect bait," Mason corrected, "and it worked. He took you to the penthouse. He slept with you. He cares about you, which means now he will die for you." Dante Moretti did not look like a man who was about to die. He looked like the angel of death. He stood in the back room of a dimly lit gambling den in the meatpacking district. The owner of the den, a nervous man named Sal who acted as an informant for the Vascari family, was currently pinned to a pool table by Marco. Dante stood over him, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, which were stained with a speck of blood that was not his own. "I will ask you one more time, Sal," Dante said softly. "Where is Mason Vane keeping her?" "I don't know, Dante, I swear." Sal spluttered, sweat dripping from his nose. "Mason is a ghost. He doesn't tell me about his safe houses." Dante picked up a heavy billiard ball from the table. He rolled it between his fingers, the sound of the ivory clacking against his ring filling the silent room. "You are lying," Dante said. "Vascari moves cargo through your territory. If he is hiding a hostage, he's doing it in one of your warehouses." He raised the billiard ball. "The shipyard," Sal screamed, his eyes squeezing shut. "The old shipyard on Pier 42. Vascari bought it under a shell company last month. That's where he takes the problems he wants to bury." Dante set the ball down gently. He nodded to Marco. Pier 42, Dante said. We have 10 minutes to cross the city. The boys are already in the vans, Marco said, releasing Sal, who slumped to the floor weeping. We are heavy. Boss, rifles, vests. If Mason is there, he won't be alone. I do not care if he has the entire Vescari army with him, Dante said, walking toward the exit, his coat billowing behind him like a cape. Tonight, they all bleed. Back in the warehouse, the waiting game was over. Mason checked his watch. He seemed agitated now, pacing back and forth. He is taking too long, Mason muttered. He should have been here, unless he didn't take the bait, unless he decided you weren't worth the risk. He stopped and looked at Cassie with a sneer. Maybe you weren't as good in bed as I thought. Cassie lifted her chin. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a spark of anger was igniting. She remembered Dante on the balcony. You are not prey. Not anymore. He is coming, Cassie said, her voice surprisingly steady. Mason raised an eyebrow. Oh, you think so? I know so, Cassie said. She forced herself to hold his gaze, channeling every ounce of strength Dante had tried to instill in her. And when he gets here, Mason, he is not going to negotiate. He is going to dismantle you. Mason laughed, but it sounded brittle. You think he's a hero? Cassie? He's a killer, just like me. The only difference is he wears better suits. No, Cassie said. He's nothing like you. You hurt people because you are weak. You need to feel powerful. Dante hurts people to protect what is his. That makes him dangerous in a way you will never understand. Mason's face twisted in anger. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and backhanded her. The blow snapped Cassie's head to the side. She tasted blood in her mouth, but she didn't cry. She turned her head back slowly and spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto his boots. Is that all you have? She challenged me. Mason's eyes went black. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sinister-looking case. He opened it to reveal a syringe filled with a clear liquid. No, Mason whispered. I have this. He flicked the needle. A tiny droplet of liquid sprayed into the air. A little cocktail Vescari's doctor cooked up, Mason said, stepping closer. It won't kill you, not immediately, but it will scramble your brain. It wipes memories, motor functions, personality. When Dante finds you, you will be a drooling vegetable, a hollow shell. He will have to spend the rest of his life spoon-feeding the woman he failed to save. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over Cassie. This was worse than death. To be erased again, to lose herself just as she had found someone worth being found for. No, she gasped, shrinking back against the chair. Hold still, Mason hissed, grabbing her jaw with his free hand. He brought the needle toward her neck. Boom! The massive metal doors at the far end of the warehouse didn't just open. They disintegrated. An explosion rocked the foundation of the building, blowing the doors inward in a shower of twisted metal and sparks. Mason stumbled back, dropping his hold on Cassie. Through the smoke and debris, silhouettes emerged. They moved with military precision, fan-shaped and lethal. Gunfire erupted instantly, short, controlled bursts. Mason's hired guard, who had been lurking in the shadows of the catwalks, returned fire, but they were outmatched. Dante's men swept into the room like a tide, and at the front of the wave was Dante. He wasn't taking cover. He wasn't shouting orders. He was walking straight down the center aisle, a semi-automatic pistol in each hand. He fired with mechanical efficiency. Double tap. Shift target. Double tap. A guard on the gantry fell. Another behind a crate crumpled. Dante's eyes were locked on the center of the room, locked on Cassie. Kill him! Mason screamed to his remaining men, scrambling for cover behind a stack of oil drums. Kill the girl! A guard popped up from behind a forklift, aiming his rifle at Cassie. Dante didn't break stride. He snapped his left arm up and fired a single shot. The guard dropped before his finger could tighten on the trigger. Marco! Flank left! Dante roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony of gunfire. The warehouse was a war zone. Bullets pinged off the concrete floor and sparked against the metal pillars. The noise was deafening, a continuous thunder of violence. Cassie huddled in the chair, making herself as small as possible. She watched Dante move. He was terrifying. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of vengeance tearing through the room. He moved from cover to cover, closing the distance, his focus absolute. Mason realized his men were falling too fast. He looked at the exit, then at Cassie. He made a choice. He lunged from behind the oil drums, sprinting toward Cassie. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back, and jammed the syringe against her carotid artery. "Stop!" Mason screamed. "One step and I push the plunger." The gunfire died instantly. Dante froze. He was 20 feet away. His guns were raised, leveled at Mason's head, but Mason was using Cassie as a human shield. His body was tucked behind hers, only his eyes and the hand holding the deadly needle visible. "Drop the guns! Moretti!" Mason shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Drop them, or she is gone. You know what this is? You know what Vescari cooks up?" Dante stood motionless. His chest was heaving, his suit jacket torn, his face smeared with soot, his eyes were burning coals. "Let her go. Mason," Dante said. His voice was frighteningly calm amidst the echoes of the battle. "Drop the guns," Mason shrieked, pressing the needle tip into Cassie's skin. She winced, a tear tracking through the blood on her cheek. Dante's eyes flickered to Cassie's. He held her gaze. In that split second, a silent communication passed between them. "Trust me." Dante slowly opened his hands. The two pistols clattered to the concrete floor. "There," Dante said, holding his empty hands up. "I am unarmed. It is just you and me." Mason grinned, a manic, triumphant look twisting his face. "You really are a fool for a pretty face. Vescari was right. You are soft." "Come and finish it then," Dante goaded him. "Or are you going to hide behind a woman forever?" Mason's ego flared. He shifted slightly, preparing to shove Cassie aside and shoot Dante with the gun tucked in his belt. In that fraction of a second, as Mason shifted his weight, moving his leg out from behind the shelter of the chair, Dante moved. He didn't lunge. He didn't dive for his guns. He reached into his sleeve. A small, concealed holdout pistol slid into his palm. Bang! The shot was deafening in the silence. Mason screamed. His right knee exploded in a spray of red mist. He collapsed, the syringe flying from his hand and skittering harmlessly across the floor. Cassie tipped over in the chair, hitting the ground hard, but she was alive. She was safe. Dante was on him before Mason hit the floor. He kicked Mason's gun away and pinned him to the concrete. Dante didn't use his weapon. He tossed the holdout gun aside. Mason writhed in agony, clutching his shattered knee. He looked up at Dante, his face pale and sweaty, but the malice was still there. "Do it," Mason spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "Kill me. It won't change anything. You are a monster. Moretti, look at you, covered in blood. Violence is all you know." Mason turned his head to look at Cassie, who was struggling to sit up, her eyes wide with shock. "She saw you tonight, what—" Mason sneered. "She saw what you really are. She will never love someone like you. She will always see the blood." Something inside Dante snapped. The carefully constructed walls of his control crumbled. The fear of losing her. The rage at what had been done to her. The years of protecting his family from men like this. It all boiled over into a white-hot fury. Dante roared, a sound of pure, primal anguish. He brought his fist down. There was a sickening crunch as his knuckles connected with Mason's jaw. Dante hit him again, and again, and again. "You touched her!" Dante shouted, each word punctuated by a blow. "You touched her!" Mason stopped sneering. He stopped moving, but Dante didn't stop. He was lost in the violence, hammering his fists into the man who had haunted the woman he loved. He was destroying the threat, reducing it to nothing, ensuring it could never rise again. "Dante!" The voice was distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. "Dante, stop!" A hand grabbed his shoulder, then an arm wrapped around his chest. "Dante, please!" The scent hit him. Rain, fear, vanilla, Cassie. Dante froze. His fist raised for another strike. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His knuckles were split and bleeding. Beneath him, Mason was unconscious, his face a ruin, but still breathing shallowly. Dante blinked, the red haze slowly clearing from his vision. He looked up. Cassie was there. Her hands were free. Marco must have cut her bonds while Dante was distracted. She was kneeling beside him in the blood and the dirt. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her eyes were clear. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with desperate, pleading love. She grabbed his raised fist with both of her small hands and pulled it down to her chest. "Stop," she sobbed, pressing his bloody hand against her heart. "He is done. You won. Don't kill him like this. Don't become like them." Dante stared at her. "He hurt you." "I know," Cassie whispered. "But if you beat him to death while he is defenseless, you lose yourself. And I need you. I need the man who saved me, not the monster they want you to be." Dante looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He looked at Mason's broken body. Then he looked back at Cassie. She was his anchor. In the middle of the hell Vescari had built, she was the only thing keeping him human. Slowly, Dante lowered his hands. He slumped back, sitting on his heels, his breath shuddering out of him. "Okay," he whispered hoarsely. "Okay." Marco stepped forward then, his face grim. "Police sirens. Boss, 2 minutes out. We have to go." Dante nodded numbly. He stood up, swaying slightly, and reached down. Cassie took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs weak from the ordeal, and he caught her instantly. He swept her up into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I have you," he murmured into her ear. "I have you. I know," she wept, clinging to his ruined shirt. They turned and walked out of the warehouse. Behind them, Marco and the crew began the cleanup, dragging Mason's unconscious body to be dealt with by the law, a fate worse than death for a man who lived in the shadows. They stepped out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. The distance was filled with the wail of approaching sirens, a chaotic symphony of the world waking up to the violence. But in the circle of Dante's arms, Cassie felt a strange, profound peace. They were broken. They were bloody. They carried scars that would never fully fade, but they were alive, and for the first time, they were free. The silence in the penthouse bedroom was different now. It was no longer the silence of a cage, nor the silence of a waiting storm. It was the heavy, velvet silence of a sanctuary. Cassie drifted in and out of sleep for the first 24 hours. Her body was a map of aches. Her wrists were raw from the ropes. Her cheek was swollen where Mason had struck her, and her muscles screamed with the memory of the tension she had held for days. But every time she surfaced from the darkness of exhaustion, he was there. Dante sat in the velvet armchair by the bed, watching her. He had cleaned himself up, the blood washed away, the ruined suit replaced with a fresh shirt and slacks, but his eyes were haunted. He looked like a sentinel who had forgotten how to stand down. He watched her chest rise and fall as if her breathing were the only thing tethering him to the earth. When she finally woke fully, the afternoon sun was slanting through the blinds, painting stripes of gold across the duvet. She shifted, wincing slightly as her stiff muscles protested. Dante was at her side instantly. He didn't speak. He reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and held it to her lips, his hand steady and cool against her feverish skin. She drank greedily, the water soothing her parched throat. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in hours. Cassie sank back against the pillows. She took inventory of herself. She hurt. Yes, but the fear, the cold, biting terror that had lived in her marrow for 3 years was gone. It had been beaten out of existence in that warehouse, left on the concrete floor alongside a broken man. "I feel alive," she whispered. Dante's jaw tightened. He looked at the bruise on her cheek, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to erase it. "I should have killed him," he murmured, the darkness swirling in his eyes again. "I let him live because you asked. But when I look at you—" "Dante," she said softly, interrupting his spiral. He looked at her, his expression wretched with guilt. "Come here," she said. He hesitated. "I do not want to hurt you. You are bruised." "I'm not made of glass," she countered, finding a thread of her new strength. "Come here, please." Slowly, carefully. Dante sat on the edge of the bed. He kicked off his shoes and lay down beside her, keeping a respectful distance, stiff as a board. Cassie shifted, closing the gap. She rested her head on his chest, right over his heart. She could hear it beating, strong, steady, rhythmic. It was the sound of safety. She draped her arm over his waist, anchoring herself to him. "Don't say anything," she whispered, closing her eyes. "Just hold me. Just let me know you are real." Dante let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension slowly leaked out of his frame. His arm came around her, pulling her closer, careful of her injuries but desperate in his need to feel her against him. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. They lay there for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life. There were no words, no plans, no strategies, just the warmth of two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side, holding on to each other because there was nothing else worth holding on to. 5 days later, the world outside the penthouse had begun to turn again, but the direction had changed. Cassie stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room. No, her room. She smoothed down the front of the simple black dress Dante had ordered for her. Her bruises had faded to faint yellow shadows, easily hidden with a touch of makeup. She looked like herself, but sharper. Her eyes were clearer. The hunted look was gone. "Are you ready?" Dante stood in the doorway. He was back in his armor, a sharp navy suit, an impeccable tie, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a fierce protectiveness. "Yes," Cassie said. She picked up her purse. "Let's go get him." The drive to the state penitentiary took 2 hours. They drove north, leaving the city skyline behind for the rolling gray hills of the countryside. Dante held her hand the entire way, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her fingers. A silent reassurance. The prison was a fortress of gray stone and razor wire. It was a place designed to strip hope from the soul. But as Cassie walked through the security checkpoints, her head held high. She felt like she was bringing the light in with her. They sat in a private visitation room. The heavy steel door on the other side opened, and a guard escorted a young man in. Luca Moretti looked like Dante, but softer around the edges. He had the same dark eyes, but where Dante's were hardened by war, Luca's were weary with injustice. He wore a beige jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. When he saw Dante, Luca's face lit up with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. "Brother," Luca breathed, sitting on the other side of the glass partition. "Luca," Dante said, leaning forward, his hand pressed against the glass. "I told you I would fix it." Luca looked at Cassie. Confusion flickered in his eyes. "Who is this?" "This is Cassandra," Dante said, looking at her with a reverence that made Luca's eyebrows shoot up. "She is the reason we are going to win." Cassie stepped forward. She picked up the receiver phone on the wall and waited for Luca to do the same. "Hello? Luca?" she said, her voice steady. "I know you don't know me, but I know what Adrian Vascari did to you. He did the same thing to me. He used us to hurt your brother." Luca gripped the phone. "Vascari is untouchable. He has judges, cops, the press." "Not anymore," Cassie said. "Mason Vane is in police custody. He's singing like a bird to cut a deal. He gave them the location of the weapon used to frame you. But that is not enough. The public needs to know why." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to tell them," she said. "I am going to the press. I am going to tell them about the stalking, the scar, the blackmail. I am going to show them the monster Vascari really is. They can ignore a gang war, Luca, but they cannot ignore a woman who survived his brutality." Luca stared at her, stunned. He looked at Dante. "Dante, you can't let her do that. It puts a target on her back." "She knows," Dante said, his voice thick with pride. "She chose this. She is not asking for permission. Luca, she is leading the charge." The storm that followed was not made of rain and wind, but of ink and camera flashes. Cassie kept her promise, with Dante standing like a stone monolith behind her. She stood on the steps of the courthouse and spoke to a sea of microphones. She didn't hide her face. She didn't hide her name. She told the story of the waitress from Red Pines who had been hunted by a crime lord. She spoke of the fear, the manipulation, and the scar on her side that marked her as property. Her story was the spark that ignited the dry timber of the city's corruption. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The headlines screamed Vascari's name, not as a businessman, but as a predator. The cover-ups unraveled. Politicians who had been in Vascari's pocket scrambled to distance themselves. The district attorney, sensing which way the wind was blowing, reopened Luca's case with a vengeance. Mason Vane's confession provided the physical evidence, but Cassie's testimony provided the moral imperative. 2 weeks after the raid on the warehouse, the heavy steel gates of the penitentiary opened. Dante stood by the car, sunglasses shielding his eyes, but Cassie saw the single tear that tracked down his cheek as Luca walked out. A free man. The brothers embraced, a fierce, crushing hug that spoke of years of lost time and silent suffering. When they broke apart, Luca turned to Cassie. He didn't say a word. He simply took her hand and kissed it, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute respect. The Vascari empire crumbled. Adrian Vascari was indicted on 30 counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and kidnapping. His assets were frozen, his allies scattered. The threat that had loomed over the city for a decade dissipated like smoke in the wind. Peace returned to the penthouse, but it was a different kind of peace. It was the quiet of a new beginning. Dante found Cassie on the balcony one evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of violet and burnt orange, the same colors as the night they had first kissed in the rain. She was leaning against the railing, looking out at the city that no longer terrified her. Dante came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her immediately. He seemed to be wrestling with something. "It is done," he said quietly. "Luca is safe. Vascari is gone. The police protection detail has been called off." "I know," Cassie said, smiling at the horizon. "It feels strange to just breathe." "Cassandra," Dante said. The seriousness in his tone made her turn. He was looking at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You are free now, truly free. The debt is paid. The danger is gone." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I have set up an account for you," he said, his voice devoid of inflection, though his eyes betrayed a storm of emotion. "There is enough in there to go anywhere. Paris, Rome, the coast. You can open a restaurant. You can buy a house by the ocean. You can have the life you dreamed of, the quiet life, a safe life." Cassie looked at the envelope, then up at his face. "You are sending me away?" "I'm giving you a choice," Dante corrected. "I am a selfish man. Cassandra, I want to keep you here, in this tower, forever. I want to wake up next to you every day for the rest of my life, but my life, it will never be entirely clean. I am who I am. There will always be shadows." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You deserve the light. You deserve a life where you don't have to wonder if the car behind you is a friend or a foe. I am offering you the door, because I love you too much to lock it." Cassie stared at him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the terrifying possibility that she might actually take the envelope and leave. He was breaking his own heart to save her soul. She reached out and took the envelope from his hand. Dante flinched, a microscopic movement, as if he had been struck. Cassie held the envelope up. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, she tore it in half, then in quarters. She opened her hand and let the pieces of paper flutter over the balcony railing, drifting down toward the city streets like confetti. "Cassandra," Dante breathed, his eyes widening. "I don't want a quiet life," Cassie said, stepping into his space. She placed her hands on the lapels of his jacket, gripping the fine wool. "I lived a quiet life. Dante, it was lonely, it was cold, and it was a lie." She looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the reflection of her own soul. "You think you are the only one with shadows?" she asked. "I have scars, Dante, inside and out. I don't want someone to protect me from the world. I want someone to stand beside me while we face it." She rose on her tiptoes, bringing her face inches from his. "I choose you," she whispered fiercely. "I choose the danger. I chose the tower. I choose the man who makes problems disappear. But listen to me. Dante Moretti. I will never be your weakness. I will be your match. Dante let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground, burying his face in her neck. My match. He groaned against her skin. God help the world. You are my match. He kissed her then. A kiss that tasted of forever. It wasn't desperate like the warehouse, or tentative like the kitchen. It was solid. It was a seal on a contract written in blood and love. 3 months later, the annual Red Pines Charity Gala was the event of the season. It was held in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, a space of crystal chandeliers, gold leaf, and heavy velvet curtains. The room was filled with the city's elite, politicians, business tycoons, socialites. A hush fell over the room when the double doors opened. Dante Moretti walked in. He wore a black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders like a second skin, his dark hair swept back, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. But for the first time in history, no one was looking at Dante. They were looking at the woman on his arm. Cassandra Hart wore a gown of deep, blood-red silk that flowed over her curves like water. It was backless, daring, and elegant. On her left side, the fabric dipped low enough to hint at the faint, jagged line of a scar, no longer hidden, but worn as a badge of survival. She walked with her head high, her hand resting lightly in the crook of Dante's elbow. She didn't look like a waitress. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped. A senator, an old associate of the Moretti family, stepped forward, a glass of champagne in his hand. Dante, he greeted, his eyes sliding appreciatively to Cassie. And who might this lovely creature be? I don't believe we've been introduced. Dante stopped. He turned to look at Cassie, his eyes softening with a warmth that stunned the room. He placed his hand over hers on his arm. Senator, Dante said, his voice carrying clearly over the low hum of the orchestra. This is Cassandra, my partner. He looked around the room, meeting the gazes of the curious and the envious. And Dante added, a dangerous smile touching his lips. She's the only woman I will ever answer to. The declaration was absolute. It was a public claim, a warning to enemies and a promise to friends. Cassie squeezed his arm, smiling up at him. She wasn't afraid of the eyes anymore. Let them look. The orchestra transitioned into a slow, sweeping waltz. Dance with me? Dante asked, ignoring the senator. Always, Cassie replied. He led her to the center of the floor. The crowd parted, giving them space. Under the glittering light of the chandeliers, Dante pulled her close. His hand settled on her waist, that familiar, possessive grip that had once been her anchor in a storm and was now her home. They moved together effortlessly, swaying to the music. The world outside the ballroom faded away. There were no cameras, no whispers, no past, just the heat of his body against hers. Dante leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. Do you remember the alley, he whispered, when you ran into me? I remember. Cassie smiled, resting her cheek against his shoulder. I told you he was following me. Dante tightened his hold, spinning her slowly. I told you that predators circle back, but I was wrong about one thing. He pulled back slightly so he could look into her eyes. The love in them was fierce, consuming, and terrifyingly beautiful. No one will ever follow you again, Cassandra, Dante vowed, his voice rough with emotion. Only I will. To the ends of the earth, only I will. Cassie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. She looked over Dante's shoulder at the grand doors of the ballroom. She thought about the cold streets of Red Pines, the lonely apartment, the girl who had thrown away a black card because she was afraid to hope. She looked back at Dante, at the man who had burned down the world to save her. I'm not running anymore, she whispered. No, Dante agreed, leaning in to kiss her, right there in the center of the floor, for all the world to see. You are home. The music swelled, drowning out the applause, drowning out the city, drowning out the fear. It was over. She was safe. And she was finally home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Cassie and Dante as much as I enjoyed writing it for you. It was a roller coaster of danger, secrets, and passion, and I'm so glad we could reach this happy ending together. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the Mafia Romance Stories channel so you never miss an upcoming episode. I have many more thrilling and romantic tales waiting for you. Please share your thoughts on the ending in the comments in English. Did you like Cassie's choice? What was your favorite moment? I can't wait to read your feedback. Until next time, keep believing in love that is worth fighting for.